haven't guessed, all of these are politicians using the John A. Macdonald method of dealing with stress.
Präsident Hirsch, ich bedauere das zutiefst, aber onopgelost blijft. Ik ben akkoord. Onopgelost blijft.
And when you think about it, it sure explains a lot. April 28th, 2026, and I'm going to say this, there is probably a good reason Canadian schools no longer teach Canadian political history in their curriculums. It's simply not appropriate for children. In fact, I'd say it's probably better to have a book about learning to be gay with your friends using the most explicit photography possible than it is to read a book trying to explain how John A. Macdonald managed to live to the ripe old age of 76. Never mind how he managed to be Prime Minister of Canada twice. But if you want to understand the tried, tested, and true Canadian method of hierarchy arrangement based solely on promoting those who fail the hardest, look no further than our first and honestly least talked about Prime Minister and Father of Confederation itself. For the record, when I say least talked about, I mean least properly talked about. No story has been glazed over quite so much as John A. Macdonald's has. Both the red and blue ties love to fight over John's statue today, but they both ignore the fact that the man was essentially a high-functioning chaos engine. John A. Macdonald's youth can be summed up in just a few sentences. His dad failed so hard in jolly old Scotland that rather than stick around and face the music for his rapidly escalating debt, Hugh Macdonald did what every responsible adult does when they fall behind in their obligations: find the nearest boat and sail away to a distant land where you'll never have to deal with paying back that debt ever again. To be fair, Scotland was rough back in the day, and honestly, no one can blame Hugh for failing. However, Hugh then went on to run 2 shops and a stone mill into the ground all by himself, which taught his son John a valuable lesson. The best way to get ahead in life is to never work hard, which is exactly what John did. I'll add here that I'm hyperbolizing for effect. Hugh Macdonald did go on to scrape enough together to become a town magistrate, so he wasn't a total failure. It's just funnier to say that he was. So calm down. And it worked. Honestly, turned out John A. Macdonald had finally found the secret sauce that his father had never quite realized was the birthright of the Macdonald family. By the time he was 17, John had faked his way into working at a local law firm, talking property law with grizzled veterans and writing up wills for people who were actually dying. By 19, so many people were convinced that John was the greatest lawyer in all of history that he opened his own firm, which is spectacular because John wasn't even allowed to take the bar until he was 21, meaning that John was a better lawyer out of his mother's womb than anyone else in the country was that actually had gone to, law school. Which, I mean, it highlights that Canadian universities have been bad since the beginning of time. They've always sucked. John A. Macdonald lived the plot of Mad Men in real life. Anyways, by 1843, John had pivoted from law to politics, mostly because it was far easier to pretend to care than to pretend to know something. He surrounded himself with people who enjoyed procrastination as much as he did, and by 1844 he had effectively weighted his way into provincial politics simply by doing nothing more than doing nothing better than anyone else in the room. I'm not totally hyperbolizing John's complete mastery of procrastination, by the way. It earned him the nickname Old Tomorrow. He was famously lazy. Anyways, things changed a little bit for John when his firstborn son died, and then his wife in 1850. Mostly because that was around the time John discovered the numbing effects of alcohol and how its excessive consumption could alleviate the pressure of stressful situations. John didn't become an alcoholic, so to speak, but he did binge drink before every meeting, every speech, every debate, really before everything that took even an ounce of effort, which was really on brand for John. He just found a way to forget that he'd ever done anything at all. ever, which was actually pretty close to reality. So, yeah, no big change. Despite the budding love affair with boozing, John continued to fail uphill until 1867, when Britain finally had to keep their promise to actually give Canada a leader who lived on their soil and was a member of their population. Some dude named Lord Monck, whoever the hell that is, decided he needed the laziest drunk in the room to fill the role, at least until they could have an election, and that person just happened to be John A. Macdonald. Okay, look, I know Lord Monck was the Governor General, and I know everybody knows what that is, but let's be honest. The Governor General at this point in Canada is kind of like your appendix. You don't know what it is, you don't know what it does, but you do know if it stops liking you, you're in trouble. I mean, the reality of why John A. Macdonald was selected is because he just couldn't stop talking about building a railway, and he spent so much money keeping Monk's shot glass full that I'm pretty sure they all just thought John was a great guy who should make more money so they could all just keep getting drunk together. Now, imagine being as drunk as John A. Macdonald and Lord Monck must have been and trying to lay out plans for a national railway when you can't even walk a straight line. That explains a lot, actually. I never actually believed that the Canadian Pacific Rail was a triumph of engineering because from the air, it looks like 3,000 miles of an excuse to keep the party going. Yeah, they had to avoid the shield. Right. I'm sure that's what happened. I'm sure that's what happened. So now John is interim Prime Minister of Canada, as appointed by Lord Monck, and it was time for John A. Macdonald to campaign his way into keeping the office because voting was still a thing. Of course, campaigning was very easy for John. All he had to do was convince people that they really didn't have to do all that much and stuff would just magically happen. Turns out that's a pretty good strategy. Because of John, the Civil War never came to Canada. Because of John, the Pacific Railway got half finished. All you had to do was exactly what John did. Nothing. Nothing ever. See, when John was Prime Minister, Canada was magic. And after all, doing nothing always worked for John. Why couldn't it work for you? So John won the election, because of course he did. The Canadian work ethic wins every time. For 2 years, John just basically went about his days drinking and puking and drinking and puking and occasionally signing something he'd never read because that's how you run a country when you're north of the USA. But then came 1869. I mean, nothing changed for John. Nothing ever changed for John. But it did for a dude named Louis Riel. See, in 1869, John A. Macdonald decided he was going to buy 3 million square miles of land from a place that was called the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company owned pretty much all of what we'd now call Manitoba and some of Saskatchewan. 3 million square miles for 300,000 pounds. Pound is British for money, in case you didn't know that. Anyways, John bought that land. That purchase was meant to keep those filthy Americans from taking over that particular patch of land because for some reason John thought Americans cared about ownership. Anyways, John bought that land without ever having actually checked it to see if anyone lived there. He didn't really want to do anything with it. The purchase was purely defensive. But he did send surveyors to divide that plot up into nice tiny squares, and poof, the Métis have entered the chat. Now, did John care that the Métis had entered the chat? What do you think? Of course not. By the rule of John A. Macdonald, the less you do, the more likely you are to win. So no, John didn't send any apology for taking over land that was already owned by the Métis. There was no diplomacy. John's strict rule between no work between 4 p.m. or after 4 p.m. remained strictly in place because that's what had always worked for John. But this was one of those rare times where doing nothing actually backfired on John a little bit. I mean, not directly. Louis Riel took advantage of John A. Macdonald's procrastination strategy and actually formed his own government. Because if John wasn't going to send a governor, then who would do it? So if John A. Macdonald was the patron saint of faking it, Louis Riel was the patron saint of taking everything personally. By 1870, Louis Riel was being harassed by a man named Thomas Scott. Thomas was what we call an orange man. No, not that orange man. The classic red tie Ontario orange man. Basically a man who saw the Métis and Catholics though, as basically nothing more than a speed bumps on the road to a British paradise. Riel got so upset with Scott's bitching and Macdonald's inaction that he put Scott in front of a firing squad because he was pretty sure that the only speed bump in Manitoba was actually Thomas Scott himself. This put John in a tough spot. Scott was from Ontario. This could not go unanswered. You can't just let a native murder one of your own citizens and do nothing. But this created a problem. This meant having to do something, which is basically against everything John A. Macdonald stood for. The reality was that John had never actually tried to do anything that didn't include doing nothing. That scared him a little. But it was either do something or let Ontario itself hang him for doing nothing, and since being hanged looked like the opposite of winning, John closed his eyes, pushed play for the very first time in his entire life. So John did as close to nothing as was humanly possible. He sent 1,200 soldiers to what is now Manitoba. He told Ontario he was going to get Riel. And then he told Quebec that he was just going to make sure everything was okay. But by the time the troops got to their destination, Louis Riel had already fled to the States because Louis Riel liked doing things. So it turned out doing something actually worked out perfectly, as if John had done nothing. John won with minimal effort. Again, shortly after, Macdonald created Manitoba. At the time, it was called the Postage Stamp Province, or something like that, because it was so small. He promised 1.4 million acres of land in Manitoba to the Métis, basically to make up for Riel. But he never actually intended to give it to them. He just needed them to shut up for a second while he did nothing to figure out how this was actually going to work. In the meantime, Louis Riel actually got elected to Parliament 3 times while he hid out in the States. Now, you'd think that John A. Macdonald would be upset that Louis Riel had escaped justice, but actually, the reverse was true. John loved the drama of Riel running around in the States so much that he actually paid Louis Riel to stay in the States because Louis was such an effective living martyr. And that, according to John, was a lot better than a dead rebel. With that drama behind us, we find ourselves in 1872, and John A. had once again procrastinated himself into a bit of a mess. He'd promised British Columbia a railway to get them into Confederation, but he was broke. You see where this is going? Listen up, kids. They seriously don't teach this in school. Because John was so broke, he was also vulnerable. And because he was so lazy, raising the money was not an option. So instead, John found himself being approached by a man named Sir Hugh Allan. Now, I'm sure it's a coincidence that this man shared a name with John's father, but that's kind of a cool little trivia fact you can, take with you. Hugh Allan was super rich. He was a massive tycoon, and he wanted the contract to build the railway from BC to Ontario. So John told Hugh that he would give him the contract to build the railway if Hugh gave him the money to win the 1872 election. Today, we would call this lobbying, but back in 1872, this is what they called a bribe. Yes, Canada basically just turned the term bribery into lobbying, and now it's legal. How very statesmanlike of us. By 1873, the opposition party had gotten a hold of a single telegram message, not the app, an actual piece of paper with a message on it. And a message that said, I must have another 10,000, will be the last time calling, do not fail me, answer today. When that message was released into Parliament, John A. didn't call a press conference. He didn't resign. He didn't. He did the most John A. Macdonald thing humanly possible. John A. Macdonald went on a 7-day bender. He got so drunk he actually collapsed in the hallway in the House of Commons. And while the country was screaming for his head, he passed out so deeply and so thoroughly that even old Tomorrow got concerned that he was procrastinating maybe just a little too much. When he managed to pull himself up by his bootstraps, Johnny finally gave his 5-hour defense speech with a bottle of water. Right, it was water, and said the single most famous line in Canadian political history. I know that I have no personal influence. At any rate, I have never tried to cultivate it. I am a man of the people. I would rather have John A. drunk than George Brown sober. Now, George Brown was John's main rival. He worked for the Globe and Mail and covered the whole telegram thing. John hated him. He hated him so much. To paraphrase what John meant when he said that is, yes, I'm a mess. Yes, I'm a drunk. I'm a thief. I'm a liar. And I even hate myself. But at least I'm not a nerd like George. The audacity. And for the first time, John A. Macdonald actually failed down. Alexander Mackenzie won the election. John stepped down in utter disgrace. Well, except not really. By 1878, Alexander Mackenzie was struggling so badly that John A. Macdonald got a second term. But that's going to be another video because this one is already a little long. We'll have to talk about Alex and the debacle that he was before we can get back to John and what happened during his second term. See, what John A. Macdonald figured out is that Canada is far too cold, far too harsh, far too big, and far too spread out to ever be able to tell people what to do. What you tell Canadians is what they don't have to do. You could be the drunkest, laziest, most inoperable man in the entire Great White North, but as long as you're worth talking about, you can also be the man people love the most. And things really haven't changed. So when we call John A. Macdonald the Father of Confederation, we're really being very loose with the term. We don't teach the official story of John A. Macdonald, especially not his first term, largely because it's a lie. The reality of John A. Macdonald was a whole lot less heroic than it's talked about today, but you do have to admit, the story is incredibly Canadian.